Let's take a ride together. If we were to get on a plane and fly from Helsinki to Tokyo, how long do you think that flight would take? When Finnair first started this service in early 2020, that flight took about 9.5 hours. But fast forward a few years, by the time it got to 2023, the same flight between the same two cities run by the same carrier was now taking 13 hours. Clearly, the two cities haven't grown further apart, at least not in this short period of time. So what's going on over here? Once the conflict between Russia and Ukraine broke out, Western carriers like Finnair were no longer allowed to fly over Russian airspace. So they had to fly around, taking a longer route, resulting in a greater flight time. Now, this is just one example of how global companies have to change their operations and are being impacted by geopolitics and geopolitical events in all kinds of ways. And Finnair is hardly the only example. Some 85% of banks, hedge funds, and financial firms cite geopolitics as a major concern. But it wasn't always this way. Once upon a time, the playbook for global companies was clear. Focus on efficiency, product quality, innovation, and customer service. And if you could do this well, you were rewarded in the global marketplace. So companies went to the far corners of the world trying to achieve these objectives. And the ones that could get them were rewarded handsomely. And there was this sense of possibility. Even if it was never perfect in practice, there was this sense of possibility. Even if you were a small company, a startup even, that wasn't necessarily a handicap. You could come from a developing country, you could come from an emerging economy, and that company was not necessarily shut out from the global markets. If you had a product that was innovative enough, if you had a service that was efficient enough, you could still compete in this global marketplace and you could be successful. That was a promise. It was alluring. But in a world today that is dominated by conflict, by trade wars, by export controls, sanctions, that playbook has been shredded to bits. We need a new way of thinking about how companies operate in the global sphere. We need a new way to identify what makes companies successful in this new world. My name is Srividya Jandhyala, and I'm a researcher and a professor. And based on the work that we have done, I'm going to argue that the defining feature, what makes some companies successful in this new world, the defining feature is corporate nationality, or where the company is from, the country of origin. This is the defining feature of geopolitical risk. To understand why this is the case, let's go back to our airline example. Now, when Western carriers like Finnair were prevented from flying over Russian airspace, this wasn't the case for some other carriers, like the Chinese carriers, for instance. So they could still fly over Russian airspace, potentially getting a shorter flight time. Let's compare two flights. On August 7th, 2024, these were two flights between Beijing and London. As you can see, the British Airways flight flew around Russian airspace, clocking in a flight time of 12 hours and 41 minutes. But China Southern had a flight time that was 2.5 hours shorter, flying over Russian airspace, taking a shorter route. So when customers are trying to determine which airline I should book my flight on, they're thinking not just about, well, how comfortable is my seat going to be? What's the quality of the meal that I'm going to get? Or how good is the in-flight entertainment system? They're also thinking about the cost, and they're thinking about the nationality of the carrier. So the real question over here, for companies that are operating in the global sphere, the real question becomes, where are you really from? Why does the answer to this question matter? The answer to this question matters because geopolitics is also about economics. When a company is making a decision, when they're trying to decide, should we invest in this new opportunity? What about expanding in a new market? What about taking on the project that comes up in another country? Should we do this? We typically tend to think of these decisions as business decisions. There are commercial considerations over here. How long is this project going to last? What is the net present value of this investment? When will my company see returns? Does my company have the right structure, the capabilities, the resources that we need to pull off this investment successfully? This is what we think of as the typical business decision. Now, sometimes what might be a smart decision for a company may actually end up having adverse consequences for a country's economy and security. So governments are really worried about the national security implications of business decisions. Now consider the semiconductor industry. Now China was a large and lucrative market for many American chip exporters. Now Chinese companies that were manufacturing all kinds of products used American chips in the goods that they made and sold in both domestic markets as well as in export markets. Everything from semiconductors and electronics to chips and coffee makers and cars and everything in between. So the Chinese government may be concerned that the Chinese companies are dependent on a foreign actor. What would happen to the Chinese economy, industry, and military if the Americans could simply turn on and off the supply of these critical ingredients? Now, governments are also worried about the rents that are generated in their markets. Now, Chinese government, for instance, may be worried about American companies that create rents or profits through sales in China, and they repatriate those sales and revenues back to their home country. Now, beyond rewarding shareholders, that income could be plowed back, let's say, into R&D, creating further commercial and military advantages. So governments worry about this as well. And finally, governments worried about how companies can be coerced by their home governments. Even if the company had no intention of acting this way, they could be coerced by their home government to act in ways that support their geopolitical interests. They worry about things like data security, privacy, information gathering, and so on. So for all these reasons, a business decision might end up having national security implications, and governments then want to create incentives for private companies that change their behavior. So they go look in their toolbox. They open up their toolbox and find that they have a whole bunch of policy tools that they could use. Everything from tariffs, sanctions, export controls, quotas, subsidies. These are just a few. But why do they use this? They use these types of tools to try to change the way companies are incentivized and act. Essentially, what they're trying to do is change the structure of global competition. So our CEO, who was previously interested in trying to make a decision based on commercial criteria, now has a whole new set of worries. She's worried about something like market access. What if we decide to plow in thousands or millions or even billions of dollars into a new country or a new investment in a foreign country? And suddenly we find ourselves shut out of this market. What do we do then? Or companies are worried about whether they will have a level playing field. Will my company compete on the same terms and conditions in a foreign market compared to domestic companies over there? What if the rules and regulations that I have to face are different from the ones that my competitors from another country face? So they're worried about whether they will compete on a level playing field. Companies are worried about investment security, not just of their physical assets, but also their human assets. They worry whether property rights are going to be secure. They consider whether their employees and managers are going to be safe. So investment security becomes an issue. And finally, they worry also about institutional alignment. As countries choose different standards, technical information, different regulations, the cost of adaptation from one market to another goes on increasing. And at some point, all of these costs just add up, and it no longer makes sense for this company to invest in a foreign market. It no longer makes sense for these companies to expand to foreign markets. A useful analogy is a game of Jenga. Now, in this game, you take a bunch of wooden blocks, stack them up to make a tall freestanding tower. Now, when the game begins, the tower is really stable. But as the game starts and the players knock out blocks, then the tower begins to take a hit. At first, however, the tower is still stable. The first couple of blocks that you knock out doesn't really change much. It still continues to be pretty stable. As the game progresses and you knock out more blocks, it starts getting shaky. But it might still stand. until it becomes one block too many and the whole tower collapses. The same is true for global companies. As the geopolitical frictions and the policy-induced frictions start increasing, at first, companies can still find workarounds. They still are competing and operating in international markets because they can find a way to get around some of these tensions and these frictions. But as the costs keep going up, at one point it becomes one too many, and then the whole tower collapses and companies decide it's no longer worth it to invest in these international markets. And they're no longer global companies. So at this point, is it all just doom and gloom? Not necessarily. What we need is a new playbook. We need a new playbook for global companies that compete in this new world. What would that new playbook look like? Well, for one, companies that are successful in this new world are going to recognize that their investments, their decisions, their business decisions have some kind of national security implications. Even if it seems really remote at first, they understand that there could be national security implications of their investments. Successful companies recognize that their opportunities would also come from their corporate nationality. Take the case of tariffs. Tariffs are usually applied on a whole bunch of countries from a given country. But what if the tariff rate that your company has in an important export market is lower than the tariff rates that apply to your competitors from another country? Now suddenly you've created a market opportunity that may not have existed before. Leading companies also understand that sometimes product characteristics matter much less than corporate nationality. When the US government decided to ban the popular antivirus software made by Moscow-based Kaspersky Labs, they were not worried about the product characteristics. In fact, this was a super efficient product. Independent testing had already established that this was best in class. But when the government decided to ban it, it was because of national security concerns. But this also creates an opportunity for another company that may or may not have the same product characteristics or the advanced possibilities that the previous software offered, but has a more favorable nationality. So companies that are going to be successful in this new world are going to recognize that there are opportunities that can be exploited, and they will find creative ways of exploiting their corporate nationality. So at this point, you could push back and ask me, well, why should we care? Is this really just about making a few rich companies richer? I would argue, no. And to explain why, I invite you to participate in a little exercise. I would like you to take 5 seconds and close your eyes. Go on, close your eyes, and think about what you believe is the biggest challenge facing humanity today. You might have come up with any number of big challenges. The world is not short of problems. Maybe it was something like, how do we feed a growing population? How do we deal with global pandemics? What about this ever-increasing income disparity? What about sustainability, climate change, pollution? How do we deal with mass migration? These are all what we call global problems. They are global problems because the solution to any of these problems cannot be obtained by just one actor in one country solving this issue. We need globally coordinated action. We need a way to coordinate and act across countries to achieve any meaningful solution to these problems. And here's the thing, this is not something that governments can probably do just by themselves. We need all the ingenuity, the innovativeness, the efficiency, and the reach of global companies if we are going to try to solve these problems. So while the work remains in trying to identify the appropriate guardrails and regulating the actions of global companies are part of the solution to global problems. Thank you very much.